Trinity Adebayo stood at the edge of the grand ballroom with a bouquet of white roses digging into her palm, and a smile stretched so tight across her face it ached at the hinges of her jaw. She was 21 years old, dressed in wine-colored silk her sister had picked without asking her opinion, and she was watching the man she had loved for 2 years walk toward the altar to marry her older sister instead. The Whitfield Grand Ballroom in downtown Chicago had been rented for the occasion, chandeliers dripping crystal light, over 200 guests in evening wear, and Trinity had been given the honor of carrying the bridal bouquet down the aisle before the ceremony, a small ceremonial role her sister Priscilla had assigned her with the same casual cruelty Priscilla applied to everything involving Trinity. Marcus Reeves stood at the altar in a black tuxedo, the same man who had told Trinity 8 months ago that he needed space to figure himself out, only to reappear 4 months later engaged to her own sister. Nobody in the family had thought to ask Trinity how that particular arrangement sat with her. Nobody ever did. She had rehearsed this smile in the mirror that morning until her cheeks went numb, because a scene at Priscilla's wedding would become a family legend told at every holiday for the next 20 years, and Trinity refused to give her sister that satisfaction. But therefore she stood there holding flowers that weren't even hers, playing a role in a ceremony that felt engineered specifically to remind her of her place in this family, which was somewhere below convenient and above forgettable. That was when the doors at the back of the ballroom opened, and the temperature of the entire room changed before anyone had said a single word. He walked in without an invitation, without an usher, without the practiced hesitation of a guest uncertain where to sit. He walked like the marble floor had been laid specifically to hold his weight and no one else's. He was tall, dressed in a black suit with no tie, the top button of his shirt undone in a way that read as authority rather than carelessness, and there was ink visible at his collarbone where the shirt gapped, dark lines climbing toward his throat. His hair was slicked back, his jaw clean and sharp, and his eyes moved across the room once, cataloging every exit, every face, before landing on Trinity and staying there. The murmur that swept the ballroom was instant. Guests turned in their seats. The officiant at the altar stopped mid-sentence. Priscilla, radiant in white lace, turned with an expression that flickered from confusion to something closer to fear before she smoothed it back into composure. The man crossed the ballroom floor directly toward Trinity, ignoring the bride, ignoring the groom, ignoring 200 guests holding champagne flutes that had suddenly gone very still in their hands. He stopped in front of her close enough that she caught the scent of him, cedar and something darker underneath, smoke maybe, or leather, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something he has already decided belongs to him. "You're mine," he said. His voice was low, even, carrying easily across a silence that had swallowed the entire room. "I apologize for the interruption. It couldn't wait." Trinity's mouth had gone completely dry. "I don't know you," she said, which was true, and also the only thing she could think to say with 200 pairs of eyes fixed on her face. "Not yet," he said. "You will." Marcus Reeves, still standing at the altar in his tuxedo with his mouth slightly open, found his voice first among the wedding party. "Who the hell are you? This is a private ceremony." The stranger did not look at Marcus. He kept his eyes on Trinity, and something in his expression, some small tightening at the corner of his mouth, suggested he found the interruption from the groom almost beneath acknowledgement. "Kang Junho," he said finally, still to Trinity, as though offering his name only to her and letting the rest of the room overhear it as a courtesy. "You work security consulting for Hallam Group's Chicago office. 3 weeks ago you flagged a discrepancy in a shipping manifest that nobody was supposed to notice. That discrepancy belonged to me." Trinity's stomach dropped through the marble floor. She did work for Hallam Group, a logistics and import firm with offices in the Loop, in a junior compliance role she had taken 18 months ago because it paid better than anything else her degree in supply chain management had qualified her for. She had flagged an irregularity in a container manifest during a routine audit, a discrepancy of weight and declared contents that hadn't matched, and she had filed the report through proper channels the way her training required, expecting nothing more than a supervisor's signature and a filing cabinet to swallow it. "That report was confidential," she said. "How do you know about it?" "Because I own the company that filed the customs paperwork on that container," Junho said. And because 3 men connected to a rival organization have been asking questions about the compliance officer who flagged it. They found your name yesterday. I found you first. The ballroom had gone from murmuring to dead silent, the kind of silence that had weight and pressure behind it. Priscilla's voice cut through it, high and sharp. Trinity, what is he talking about? What have you gotten yourself into? But therefore Trinity did not answer her sister, because the man in front of her was already turning slightly, positioning his body between her and the ballroom entrance in a way that seemed almost reflexive, a habit built from a life where doorways meant danger rather than arrivals. We need to leave, Jun-ho said, quiet enough now that it carried only to her.
Now.
Not tomorrow, not after the reception. Now. This is my sister's wedding. And in about 90 seconds, it's going to become a crime scene if the men currently parking outside get through your family's security, which consists of 2 rented ushers and a metal detector nobody is actually watching. His eyes flicked toward the ballroom doors and back to her face. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm telling you what's true. You can verify it yourself in the next 4 minutes, or you can leave with me now and verify it somewhere safer. Trinity looked past him toward the doors, and there, through the frosted glass panels, she caught the shape of 2 men in dark coats speaking to one of the ushers, one of them gesturing toward the interior of the ballroom with the particular impatience of men accustomed to being obeyed rather than questioned. Something cold moved down her spine, a physical recognition that came before conscious thought, the animal part of her brain that had kept her alive through a childhood of unpredictable adults reading danger faster than her reasoning mind could catch up. She set the bridal bouquet down on the nearest table. Trinity. Priscilla's voice cracked across the ballroom, somewhere between fury and panic. Do not walk out of this wedding. I'm sorry, Trinity said, and found, to her own surprise, that she mostly meant it, though not for the reasons her sister would assume. She was sorry for the timing. She was not sorry to be leaving a room where she had spent the last hour smiling through her own quiet humiliation. Jun-ho did not touch her, did not grab her arm the way lesser men might have to assert ownership of the moment. He simply turned and walked toward a side exit near the kitchen service doors, trusting, correctly, that she would follow, and Trinity found herself moving after him with her heart slamming against her ribs and 200 guests staring at her back like she had just set the room on fire. They came out into a service corridor lined with catering carts and the smell of warming trays, and Jun-ho moved through it with the ease of a man who had already memorized the building's layout before he ever set foot inside the ballroom. A black car waited at the service entrance, engine already running. A driver, Trinity, had not been introduced to holding the rear door open without a word. Get in, Jun-ho said. I'll explain everything you're owed an explanation for, but not standing in an alley. She hesitated for exactly 1 second, weighing the abstract danger of an unknown man against the concrete danger she had just watched gather at the ballroom's front door, and then she got in the car. The interior smelled like leather and the same cedar and smoke scent she'd caught on him in the ballroom, and Jun-ho slid in beside her, close enough that his shoulder nearly brushed hers, not close enough to seem deliberate. The car pulled away from the curb before the door had fully closed, and Trinity watched the Whitfield Grand Ballroom shrink in the rear window, her sister's wedding continuing without her, the life she had known that morning already several streets behind them. Start talking, she said, once her voice had steadied enough to be more than a whisper. Jun-ho studied her for a moment before he answered, the way a man reads a document he expects to be important. The container you flagged 3 weeks ago wasn't carrying textiles, whatever the manifest said. It was carrying currency, moving between 2 organizations that have been circling each other for the better part of a year, testing whether the old territorial agreements still hold. Your report went into a compliance file that should have stayed buried. Instead, someone in that office sold the information to the wrong people, and now the men who lost product because of your paperwork want to know exactly who flagged it and why. I flagged it because it's my job, Trinity said. I didn't know what was actually in that container. I saw a weight discrepancy, and I filed a report. That's it. That's the whole story. They don't care about intent, Jun-ho said. They care about consequence. You cost them a shipment worth more than your annual salary several times over, and men like that settle accounts regardless of whether the person who cost them the money understood what they were looking at. And you? What's your stake in this? The shipment was mine, he said simply. The organization that lost it is Hallam's silent partner in half its Chicago contracts, which means your compliance department works for people who work for me, several layers removed, in ways your employee handbook never mentioned. I've spent 3 weeks tracking who inside my own operation leaked your name to a rival faction, and I found the answer this morning. I came to the wedding because I ran out of time to do this quietly. Trinity absorbed this in silence, watching city blocks slide past the window, and found that the fear sitting in her chest had begun, unexpectedly, to make room for something sharper. Anger, mostly. At her employer, at whoever had sold her name, at the entire architecture of a world that had apparently been operating beneath her ordinary compliance job without her knowledge or consent. So what happens now? She asked. I go into hiding? I quit my job and disappear. Now you stay somewhere I control until I've dealt with the men who came looking for you, Jun-ho said. After that, we discuss what your life looks like going forward. But tonight, you're safe, and that's the only piece of this that matters yet. The apartment he took her to occupied the entire top floor of a converted warehouse building near the river, all exposed brick and steel beams and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over water gone dark with early evening. It was not what Trinity had expected from a man who had just described himself, however obliquely, as the head of a criminal organization. There was no ostentation in it, no gold fixtures or gaudy excess, only clean lines and quality materials chosen with obvious care, the home of a man who valued precision over display. You'll be safe here, Jun-ho said, setting his keys on a steel console table near the door. There's a guest room down the hall. Food in the kitchen, if you're hungry. I have calls to make. That's it, Trinity said. You upend my entire life in the middle of my sister's wedding, and now you're just going to disappear into another room? Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something more controlled than that. What would you prefer, Miss Adebayo? An actual conversation, she said. You know my full name, apparently. You know where I work, what I flagged, probably what I had for breakfast this morning. I know nothing about you except that you walked into a wedding and announced I belonged to you like I was a piece of property you'd misplaced. That was theater, he said. For the room, not for you. I needed every person in that ballroom to understand you were under my protection before those men reached the door, and there wasn't time for a polite introduction. I apologize if the phrasing offended you. It didn't offend me, Trinity said, surprising herself with the honesty of it. It terrified me. There's a difference. Jun-ho crossed the room and stopped a careful distance from her, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to leave room between them that felt deliberate. I've spent 15 years building an organization on the principle that fear and respect operate through the same mechanism, he said. I forgot, walking into that ballroom, that the woman I was trying to protect hadn't spent those same 15 years learning the same language. That's a failure on my part, not yours. It was, Trinity thought, the strangest apology she had ever received, wrapped in the vocabulary of a man who clearly did not apologize often, and something about its careful construction told her more about him than a simpler sentence would have. Tell me about the wound, she said, before she'd fully decided to ask it. The reason you're this careful with people. Everyone who's this precise about control learned it from something. For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer, and then he moved to the window, looking out over the dark water rather than at her, which she understood, even in that first conversation, was as close as he came to vulnerability. 6 years ago I had a partner, he said. Business and otherwise. Her name was Yoon Seo-yeon. She ran the financial side of the organization, the part that required trust one extended to almost no one else. A rival faction discovered our relationship and used it. They took her to force a territorial concession for me, and by the time I found where they were holding her, the concession no longer mattered to them. They wanted to prove a point. His voice did not change register, did not crack or waver, but something in the stillness of his shoulders told Trinity the story cost him more than the flat delivery suggested. I have not let anyone close enough to be used against me since. Until 3 weeks ago, when I read a compliance report with your name on it and found myself unable to stop thinking about the woman careful enough to catch a discrepancy nobody else in that office had noticed in 4 years. Trinity felt something loosen in her chest that she did not have a name for yet, some recognition of a grief that mirrored, in its shape if not its specifics, losses of her own. "I'm sorry," she said. "About Seo-yeon." "So am I," Jun-ho said. "Every day since." He turned from the window to look at her again. "Which is why I need you to understand precisely what you're standing in the middle of before you decide whether to trust anything I tell you. This isn't a rescue that ends with you thanking me and going back to your compliance job on Monday. The men looking for you now know your face, your family, your sister's wedding venue. That doesn't disappear, because I got you out of the building in time." "Then what does make it disappear?" "I deal with the men who leaked your name and the faction they sold it to," Jun-ho said. "Permanently and completely, so there's no ambiguity left for anyone to exploit later. That takes days, not hours. You'll stay here until it's finished." Trinity spent that first night in the guest room listening to the city outside the windows, unable to sleep, replaying the ballroom over and over, her sister's furious voice, Marcus standing frozen at the altar he'd chosen over her, and underneath all of it, the low, even sound of Jun-ho saying "you're mine" with a certainty that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with a war she had accidentally wandered into with a compliance report and a red pen. She found him in the kitchen near midnight, unable to stay in the guest room any longer, and he was standing at the counter with a glass of something amber-colored, still in the black suit from the wedding though he'd removed the jacket, sleeves rolled to the forearm, and she saw for the first time the full extent of the ink at his wrist, dark lines that disappeared beneath his rolled cuff and reappeared, she assumed, somewhere at his collarbone. "Can't sleep," she said, not quite a question. "Neither can I," he said. "Occupational hazard." She sat across from him at the kitchen island, and for a while neither of them spoke, the silence comfortable in a way she hadn't expected it to be, given the day they'd both survived. "Tell me something true," she said eventually. "Not about the organization. About you." He considered this with the same careful weight he seemed to give everything. "I learned English from American action films," he said finally. "My father sent me to a boarding school outside Seoul that emphasized business and law, but the English I actually speak, the rhythm of it, I learned from films I wasn't supposed to be watching after curfew." It was such a small, human admission, so at odds with the man who had walked into a wedding and rearranged an entire room's understanding of danger with 3 words, that Trinity found herself almost smiling for the first time since that morning. "That explains some of your dialogue choices," she said. "Was that theater too dramatic for your taste?" "It was effective," she said. "I'm still deciding how I feel about effective." He looked at her for a long moment, something behind his eyes that she couldn't fully read yet, though she was beginning to understand that very few people ever could. "You should know," he said, "that I don't do this. Bring someone into this apartment. Explain myself to anyone who works underneath the umbrella of my protection. The men who work for me have learned not to ask me questions I haven't offered to answer." "Then why me?" "I've been asking myself that since I read your report," he said. "I don't have a satisfying answer yet." The next 3 days passed in a strange, suspended rhythm, Trinity confined to the apartment while Jun-ho moved in and out at hours she didn't track, returning sometimes with tension carved into his jaw that told her without words that whatever he was doing to secure her safety carried its own cost. On the second evening, she caught him icing what was clearly a fresh bruise along his knuckles, and when she asked what happened he only said, "A conversation that required emphasis," and did not elaborate further, and she found she did not push, understanding instinctively that some doors in his world she wasn't yet meant to open. By the 3rd day the confinement had begun to wear on her, and when Jun-ho returned that evening she was standing at the window with her arms crossed, restless in a way that had nothing to do with fear anymore, and everything to do with the particular frustration of a competent woman being kept safely out of her own crisis. "I want to help," she said, before he'd even set down his keys. "Not sit here waiting for you to fix this." I flagged that manifest. "I understand shipping documentation, financial records, the kind of paper trail that actually holds up. If there's a way to use what I know instead of just hiding what I know, I want to do it." "It's not safe," Jun-ho said. Neither was standing in that ballroom while men in dark coats talked their way past your ushers, Trinity said. I'm not asking your permission, Junho. I'm telling you, I'm not going to sit in this apartment being protected like a piece of evidence while you handle everything alone. Something shifted in his face, an expression she hadn't seen from him yet, something almost like respect layered over concern. The men who leaked your name, he said slowly, did it through a mid-level compliance supervisor at Halim named Robert Castellano, who's been selling information to a faction run by a man called Dmitry Volkov for the better part of a year. Volkov wants the shipment records you flagged because they'd expose exactly how much currency has been moving through supposedly legitimate channels. If we can prove Castellano falsified the original manifest to hide the discrepancy before you caught it, we don't just protect you. We end Volkov's leverage over my entire Chicago operation. Then let me look at the records, Trinity said. I know what I'm looking for. You don't. He studied her for a long moment, weighing something she couldn't fully see, and then he nodded once, a decision made, and settled the way she was already learning he made every decision, completely and without visible second-guessing. Tomorrow, he said, you'll need access to files that no longer officially exist. That's dangerous in a different way than what you've already survived. I'm aware, Trinity said. I'm still asking. That night, working alongside him at the long table in his study surrounded by financial documents that told a story far uglier than any compliance report she'd filed before, Trinity felt the shape of something changing between them. Not romance exactly, not yet, but a kind of alignment, two people who had each spent years being careful, finding an unexpected rhythm in working a problem together. When their hands both reached for the same document at the same moment, his fingers brushed across the back of hers, and neither of them moved away immediately, the pause stretching a beat longer than accident would explain. You're good at this, Junho said, low, watching her cross-reference two ledgers with a focus that seemed to genuinely surprise him. Better than half the people I employ to do exactly this work. I told you, it's my job. She did not look up from the documents, though she felt the weight of his attention settle over her like something physical. I just didn't know my job came with a body count attached. It doesn't usually, he said. This is unusual circumstance, not standard practice. Comforting, she said dryly and caught, from the corner of her eye, something that might have been the beginning of a real smile on his face, quickly suppressed, but not quickly enough that she missed it entirely. They found what they needed near 2 a.m, a falsified weight declaration on the original manifest that did not match the custom stamp date, proof that Castellano had altered the paperwork after the fact to cover a discrepancy Trinity's later audit had caught anyway, evidence clean enough to hand a rival faction proof of betrayal from within their own supply chain rather than exposure of Junho's operation. This is enough, Junho said, studying the document with something like relief moving through his controlled expression. This gives Volkov a reason to turn on Castellano instead of chasing you. It ends the immediate threat. But not the larger one, Trinity said. Not the part where I now know more about your organization than any outside compliance officer probably should. No, Junho agreed. Not that part. She set down the document and looked at him directly, close enough now that she could see the specific dark brown of his eyes, nearly black in the study's low light, and the small scar along his jaw that she hadn't noticed until this proximity revealed it. So, what happens to me, Junho? After Volkov's dealt with. After the danger's gone, do I go back to my compliance job and pretend the last week didn't happen? I don't know, he said, and it was, she understood, the most honest answer he had given her since the ballroom. I told myself bringing you here was purely a matter of protection. I've been lying to myself about that for 3 days. Say what you actually mean, Trinity said. You don't strike me as a man who's usually short on words. I'm not short on words, Junho said. I'm short on the willingness to say something I can't take back once it's spoken. He set the ledger aside, deliberate, and the space between them had narrowed, without either of them tracking exactly when it happened. You're the first person in 6 years I've let see anything true about myself, and I did not plan for that to happen, and I do not know what to do with the fact that it happened anyway. The confession sat between them, heavier than any declaration of love could have managed, and Trinity felt something in her own chest answer it, a truth she had been keeping from herself since the black car pulled away from the Whitfield Grand Ballroom 3 days earlier. "I keep waiting to be afraid of you," she said quietly. "The way I should be, given everything you are. And every time I brace for it, I just feel this instead." "This," he repeated. "Whatever this is," Trinity said. "I don't have a clean word for it yet." He reached out and touched her jaw, careful, deliberate, the first time he had initiated contact since the ballroom, and she did not pull away. "Tell me to stop," he said, "and I will." "Don't stop," Trinity said, and closed the remaining distance herself, meeting him with a certainty that surprised her more than it seemed to surprise him. The moment held, charged and unhurried, until his phone shattered it, buzzing hard against the study table with the particular urgency of a call he could not ignore. He answered with 2 clipped words, listened for a long moment, and Trinity watched his expression shift from the openness of a minute earlier back into the controlled stillness she'd first seen in the ballroom. "Volkov knows you're here," he said, lowering the phone. "Castellano gave him this address before we could use the manifest against him. There are men on their way now." "How long do we have?" 10 minutes. Maybe less." He was already moving, pulling a weapon from a locked drawer beneath the study desk with the same economical precision she imagined he brought to everything dangerous. "You're going to the safe room down the hall. I'll handle this." "No," Trinity said, and the flatness of her own voice surprised her. "I'm not hiding in a closet while you fight a war that started because of a report I filed. Give me something useful to do instead." "This isn't negotiable, Trinity." "Neither is this," she said. "You said Castellano falsified records to hide his own theft from Volkov. If Volkov's men are coming here believing you're hiding evidence against them, the fastest way to end this without more bloodshed is to show them the evidence points at Castellano, not at you. I can pull the exact documents in 90 seconds. Let me do that while you handle the door." He looked at her for one long beat, some internal calculation resolving faster than she expected, and then he nodded once. "The documents. Nothing else. The moment I tell you to move, you move." "Understood." The next several minutes unfolded in fragments Trinity would replay for months afterward, sharp and disjointed the way real danger always is rather than the smooth choreography of films. The sound of the front door giving way under force. Junho's voice, low and absolute, giving commands to men who had clearly expected easier resistance. The specific smell of gunpowder and old brick dust that she would forever after associate with fear. She heard a struggle in the hallway, a body hitting the wall hard enough to rattle a framed photograph off its hook, and she made herself stay at the desk, hands shaking but steady enough to gather the falsified manifest and Castellano's altered ledger into a single folder exactly as she'd promised. A man she did not recognize appeared in the study doorway before Junho did, gun raised, and Trinity did not freeze the way she might have expected herself to freeze. She threw the heavy ledger book at his gun hand with everything her arm had in it, and in the half-second his aim wavered, she was already moving, shoving the rolling desk chair into his knees and following it with her shoulder into his chest, sending him backward hard enough into the doorframe that his weapon clattered free across the floor. Junho appeared behind him a moment later, and whatever happened next happened fast enough that Trinity only fully understood it had ended when the man was on the ground, and Junho was breathing hard, a shallow cut along his forearm that he did not acknowledge, already turning to check that she was unharmed. "You were supposed to move when I told you," he said, low and rough, something urgent underneath the anger. "You didn't tell me," Trinity said. "You were a little busy." 2 more of Volkov's men were subdued in the hallway by the time the building's private security, men Junho clearly trusted enough to have on standby, arrived to secure the scene, and within the hour Junho had a call placed, direct and unhurried despite everything that had just occurred, laying the falsified manifest and Castellano's altered records out for Volkov himself over a line Trinity understood was normally reserved for far more careful diplomacy. "Your man Castellano cost you the shipment," Junho said into the phone, watching Trinity across the study while he spoke, something steadying in his gaze, as though her presence anchored the conversation even as his voice carried the flat authority she now recognized as entirely genuine. "Not my compliance officer. Not my organization." Yours. I'm sending the documentation to the associate of your choosing. What you do with Castellano is your business. What you do about my organization is finished tonight, or the next conversation happens somewhere far less civil than this one. Whatever Volkov said in response, it ended the call within another minute, and Junho set the phone down with the particular stillness of a man who had just watched a war end before it truly began.
"It's over," he said.
Just like that. Volkov's a businessman before he's anything else, Junho said. Given proof his own man cost him product and lied about it, he'll spend his energy on Castellano, not on us. It won't be pleasant for Castellano, but it's over for you. Trinity felt the adrenaline finally begin to drain from her system, leaving something shaky and raw behind it, and Junho crossed the study and pulled her against him without asking, and she let him, her face against his shoulder, the cedar and smoke scent of him, now something that meant safety rather than danger. You could have died tonight, he said quietly, into her hair. Because of a discrepancy you flagged doing your job correctly.
So could you, Trinity said.
Because you walked into a wedding for a woman you'd never actually met. I'd have made that walk again, Junho said. Knowing everything I know now. 3 weeks later, Trinity sat on the balcony of the warehouse apartment that had somehow, without either of them formally deciding it, become hers as much as his, watching the river catch the last of the evening light. She had not gone back to her compliance job at Halim. Junho had offered her something else instead, a position that used the same precision and instinct that had first flagged the discrepancy that started everything, working directly for him in a capacity that had no official title but considerable authority, the kind of role built specifically around what she was actually good at rather than what a corporate hierarchy assumed a woman with her degree should be doing. Priscilla had not called. Trinity assumed, with more clarity than grief, that she probably never would, and found she could live with that, the family calculus of her life having shifted enough in 3 weeks that the loss registered as smaller than it once might have. Junho found her on the balcony as the sky went fully dark, settling into the chair beside hers without a word, his hand finding hers on the armrest between them, an easy gesture now that had cost him considerable effort the first time he'd allowed himself to make it. Regrets? He asked. Trinity considered the question honestly, turning it over the way she turned over every decision worth making. None, she said. Ask me again in a year. I intend to, Junho said, and every year after that. She looked at him in the dim light, this man who had walked into a wedding and rearranged the entire architecture of her life with 3 words, who had shown her a version of tenderness that came without softness, earned rather than given, and she found that the fear she had once braced herself to feel had settled instead into something steadier, chosen rather than accidental. You're mine, she said, testing the words in her own mouth the way he'd first said them to her, and watched something shift and open in his expression that she suspected very few people in his world ever got to witness. I already knew that, Junho said. I was only waiting for you to say it back.